Again, let's welcome everyone, especially those that are visiting with us. I meant to do that earlier, but we have a good number of visitors this afternoon. Kind of family, I guess, and maybe will be that way for many, many years. But anyway, we want to appreciate all those who are visiting with us. If we have other visitors that I haven't mentioned, please stick around a bit. Let us get a chance to talk with you before we leave today. On Sunday afternoons, we've been looking at some sermons dealing with a different book of the Bible, starting in the Old Testament book of Genesis, and working our way through these books with a sermon on not the details of every book, but some of the details of the concepts in those books. And so we're up to the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles now at this point. And I know most times people hear the term Chronicles and they think, history, just boring stuff. Well, it is history, but it's not boring stuff. We've already talked about the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, which turned out to have a lot of information in them. And Chronicles is kind of the same thing. We mentioned earlier in our study that Chronicles is a little different because it's a kind of a record of the religious history, especially of Judah, the tribes in the south, the kingdom of Judah. The 1st and 2nd Kings deals more with the 10 tribes in the north called Israel. But in essence, what we're going to look for is some of the overall concepts that really stand out in these particular books. Now, we studied the beginning part of Chronicles a week or two ago, and we got down to this part that we're looking at here, which concerns with our duty to God. And we get this starting place by looking back at 1 Chronicles chapter 28, and the time frame here is when King David is bringing into the picture his son Solomon to be king. And Solomon was the one who asked for great wisdom, and he got it, but he also got some good advice from his father David. And as David there in 1 Chronicles 28 begins to elaborate on what Solomon needs to concentrate on, we find a lot of things that are applicable to us today. Maybe none of us are going to be kings like Solomon was, but we still are servants of God, and we still need to know these broad concepts that God deals with people inside of. These concepts are how God works. So, to kind of bring us up to date, there in chapter 28, King David has assembled all of his officers and the captains of his divisions and so on, and he tells the people that it was in his heart to build God a house. But God said he would not allow David to do it. Instead, it would come during the time of his son who would succeed him as king. And so, in thinking about how important this is to be able to build the temple, up to this time all that they had was the tabernacle, a traveling tent where the presence of God was, and that's where they worshiped. But because of David's desire to build a permanent place for the worship of God, the temple, he was concerned that it be done right. And in verse 5 of chapter 28, David points out there, of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. Okay, so that's what Solomon's job was to be, sit on the throne as king. Now he said to me, it is your son Solomon who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. Moreover, this is God speaking, I will establish his kingdom forever, if he is steadfast to observe my commandments and my judgments as it is this day. Now therefore in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, this is David speaking now, he says, be careful to seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it as an inheritance to your children after you forever. So, God, through David here, is expressing to Solomon what he needs to pay attention to in order to keep this kingdom. It's what his duty will be, to keep the kingdom as it should be, as an inheritance for his children forever. God had already prophesied to David that his throne would be an eternal one. That's kind of strange, how David, who would die, would have an eternal throne, but we see it coming to life again in the New Testament in Acts chapter 2 when Peter preaches about how Jesus is now on that throne of David, just as the prophecy said would happen. But this duty that David relates here, it relates to Solomon's duty to serve God. That's basically what it was. Solomon was not anything special except for this great wisdom that he had. And we'll see later on that maybe that wisdom didn't serve him very well because he eventually departed from God. But Solomon is told some things that are important. Now, take a close look at verse 9. This will be kind of the focal point for some of our study this afternoon. And this is what David says to his son Solomon. As for you, my son Solomon, know the God of your father, and serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. And there's more that he tells him, but verse 9, there's kind of a summary of the things that David wanted Solomon to really think about as he undertook this great charge of what he was going to do to serve God. The first thing he told him was that you are to serve God, and the way you do it is with a loyal heart. Now, Solomon was one who, you start seeing how he was influenced by other people. He had many, many wives and concubines, and later on we find that all those wives came from foreign countries, and they all influenced him. They influenced him to worship pagan gods. So Solomon was just like other people. He sometimes acted human and did not pay attention to what God said. But his duty was to be, like verse 9 tells us there, serve the God of heaven with a loyal heart. Check back there at the beginning of this verse. As for you, my son Solomon, the first thing David told him was this: know the God of your father. And we talked about that last week. How do you know God? You have to know about him. You have to know who he is. You have to know some of his attributes. And we talked about those, especially how the psalmist even said the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. Solomon could witness that. He knew about God. And then through the efforts of David and all of those teachers, I'm sure that Solomon had as a young man, he learned about God's ways, what it is that God expected of him. So David had covered that part about him being one who knows the God of your father. And then the second part there, and serve him with a loyal heart. Solomon's heart is kind of like other people's hearts. His heart's like yours and mine. Its loyalty can sometimes be diverted. That's a very important idea. With God, we have a spiritual responsibility to have a loyal heart to God, just like Solomon was told here. How do you have that loyal heart? Well, let's look at some other translations. The different Bible translations can sometimes help us get a deeper understanding here. For example, the loyal heart is what it says there in the New King James translation. The New American Standard and the English Standard say, with a whole heart. The New International Version says, serve God with wholehearted devotion. What are we talking about here? Well, it's total service. Service with all of the parts of your heart. I don't mean the atriums and the ventricles and all that. I mean all the parts of our spiritual heart. Intent, thinking, emotion, all that stuff that goes together. We get a good example of this in Matthew chapter 22. If you'll turn there just for a moment, keep your place marked in Chronicles, but Matthew 22, a lawyer came to Jesus, and he asked him, he said, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Which is, if you had to pick one, which is the greatest, most important commandment? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like to it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, this young man, this lawyer, heard that. And he then knew what it meant to be a great worshiper of God. That was that your heart was to be involved. What did Jesus say there? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. But then he included these other facets. With all your soul. Soul could also mean life. Sometimes it's translated life. With all your soul, your being. And with all your mind, which is kind of how the heart operates. The mind tells it and understands things that the heart is doing. But that involves the greatest commandment. And whatever we think is important, this one is the most important. Jesus would not give us information that wasn't worthwhile. And so that's how we know what this greatest commandment is. And the loyal heart that Solomon was supposed to have was that kind of heart. Well, let's look a little farther. There in verse 9, let's go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 28. And you just keep on reading here, and here's what Solomon tells him. Serve him with a loyal heart and with a willing mind. Okay. This one we can kind of sympathize with. It's possible to carry out physical service and not have your mind very willing, right? Our children teach us this. You know, they may do what we say because we threaten them, and you do what I tell you, or else. You know, that or else could mean a lot of things. But what's usually happening? What's usually happening in the children's heart and their mind? Their mind is probably saying, grumble, grumble, but they go ahead and do what they're supposed to do. Well, is that acceptable? Parents might say, okay, they did what they were supposed to, but there's still a problem because in that mind there's not a willingness to really be what the parent says. I don't mean to just pick on kids either. Adults do this too, don't they? You know we do. We do this ourselves. Sometimes we do it and we don't like it and our mind is not willing at all. Like, well, in a few months you'll be paying your taxes, won't you? How willing are we in that now, you might ask. But the idea here is David tells Solomon, you do this with a willing mind. What does that mean? Some definitions I found. A willing mind is one which operates cordially and sincerely, cheerfully and freely. Sounds a little different than some of the things we described, doesn't it? Cheerfully and sincerely, cordially, not with friction, with friendliness somehow. But those ideas there have to do not just in everyday life, but with our spiritual life too. When God says, do this and do it my way, do we respond mentally with a cordial attitude, with a sincere and cheerful and freely accepting attitude? I mean, we need to be serious about this. How often do we say, well, God says got to do this, but I don't like it? Mind is not in the right place there when that happens. Our mind needs to be in the right framework. We call it frame of mind, don't we, sometimes? How is your mind framed? That's what we need to think about. Another definition, a willing mind is neither in a hypocritical manner, nor through force and constraint, nor with loathing and weariness. Okay, that expands that definition a little bit. A willing mind, not hypocritical, and not having to be forced or constrained. Yeah. Dragging that horse to water to make it drink. In his mind, he says, I'm drinking. Drag me here if you want to. And sometimes people operate that way too. What about this other part? Nor with loathing and weariness. Willing mind should be involved. Let's do this. Let's obey because it's good. Because we want to. Because it's going to be a good thing. Well, okay. This is the same kind of service that God expects today of all Christians. Now remember, David was talking to Solomon here. Solomon was king. And the king could have that mindset where he would say, well, I'm king. I don't like this. When God tells me to do a certain thing, I'd rather do it some other way. And if I've got to do it God's way, I'm not going to like it. Okay. But, you know, we're not kings. We're Christians. We're in the kingdom, aren't we? We serve a king, and our king says, do this, do it my way. How do we respond? We have to have this willingness of mind. Turn quickly over to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And you remember Paul wrote to these Corinthian Christians who had some problems along this line. They had done some things according to their way and not God's. But there in chapter 8 and verse 12, Paul is writing to them here about poorness and richness and how to be one who is not necessarily rich in physical things, but is rich in service to God. And he says in verse 12, "For if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what he does not have." Well, okay, now he's talking about, writing about giving here to the Corinthians. And the Corinthians could have said, well, we're poor and we don't have much, so we can't give much, right, God? No. Paul says, don't worry about that. He says, if you have a willing mind, God will consider what you have, not what you don't have. Okay, well, we can apply that. But this is the way God expects us to serve Him today. With that willing mind, it says it doesn't depend on stuff and how much of this or that of God, but what I want to do. Same opening there, chapter 9 and verse 7. We know this verse. We've heard it many times. So that each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. Well, he's still talking about giving, but look at that. He's talking about some willingness. Got a purpose in your heart. Plan what we're going to do. And also, he says, not grudgingly or of necessity. So not with an attitude of I'm being forced to do this. So, Solomon got that instruction. And our question would simply be, are we, you and I, committed to serving God completely and willingly? That's the kind of service that David told Solomon to have. All right. Let's talk about some other things, though. Solomon needed the right motivation to serve God acceptably. Turn back there to 1 Chronicles chapter 28. Notice what he says. He is told here that God will know what you're thinking. Well, that throws a wrinkle in there, doesn't it? We can't just think and have our mind doing what it wants to. God's going to know. And that's what David tells Solomon. Right in the middle of that verse, it says, "For the Lord searches all hearts and understands all the intent of the thoughts." Well, that's not fair, is it? I mean, we can't skirt around God. We can't do an end run around Him and act like we're going to do right when we're not planning to. No, God knows. He understands. And that is what that means there. God searches the hearts. Solomon was told, you better be thinking right and acting right. Sadly, that concept gets a little twisted nowadays. Sometimes people have the idea, it doesn't matter what I think as long as I do the right things, right? Wrong. It's wrong. God cares what we think. He cares how we go about putting together a plan, whatever it is. He cares about our motivation. David tells Solomon that the Lord searches all hearts. Solomon later on over in 1 Kings chapter 8, and this goes back to the first and second Kings tale, but Solomon says of God, "You alone know the hearts of all the sons of men." Solomon realized that. He made wise decisions, and he wisely pointed that out. That God knows exactly what I'm doing here. And he also would tell us that today, too. Is it possible that we might sort of deceive ourselves and think that we can do what we are told to do and think otherwise? No, it's not going to work. Very quickly again, flip over to James, the second chapter, and Bible students recognize here what James is telling us. Get over there to it. James chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. James says, "You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. Likewise was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." Well, What's that mean to us? It means you have to have the works being done to show that you know what to do, but he also points out there that you're justified by faith too. Faith with works. This is kind of what the concept is. That Solomon was told you need to have the faith in God that resides in your mind, and let that be the guide for your actions. Same with us today. In Revelation, as we read these letters that the Spirit that Jesus tells to be written to the churches in Asia Minor, over in chapter 2, verse 23, this is part of the letter that's written to the church in Thyatira. Verse 23, God has in this letter this prediction: I will kill her children with death. Speaking about those who commit adultery in the spiritual sense. I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am He, listen to this, who searches the minds and hearts. And I will give to each one of you according to your works. You see there, in this very letter to the church there, God is indicating that He knows what's in their minds and hearts, and also that their works will be guided by those thoughts. How are we going to be rewarded? By the works that we do. But how are our works determined? It's by what we think. What's in that mind that makes the works happen. There is no way we can hide our thoughts and intent from God. Wayne read for us from Hebrews, the 4th chapter, a little bit earlier this evening. Take a quick look back at that. Again, very familiar passage. The writer of Hebrews tells us here, for the Word of God is living and powerful, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of Him to whom we must give account. It's a little frightening, isn't it? Can't hide it from God. And we shouldn't want to. We should not be seeking a way to do that. But our hearts and what's in them, even the thoughts and intents that are there. So here's the real question. Since we cannot hide from God, why not just serve Him willingly? God's not going to change, so maybe we ought to change our attitude if that's what we're thinking, and change it to a willing attitude, like Solomon was told to do. Just serve God willingly, and we won't have to worry about those things. And that's kind of what we get into when we understand what this means. God understands the intents and the thoughts. He understands every motive behind our thoughts. See, this gets a little more detailed even than we might think. Not only does God understand and know what we think, He knows the why behind it. Oh, that's disturbing, isn't it? Because sometimes we think we can hide our motives from God. You know, I can think and do like I please, even though I've got an ulterior motive back here. Well, wait a minute. God sees that too. He knows why we think and do as we do. That's a little surprising. Not only the thoughts of the heart, when regularly formed and arranged in order, but even the very beginning of them, from the first motions of the mind and before they are well formed. Sounds like God really knows us, right? He knows every little nook and cranny that resides in our psyche. He knows what's there. There's no way we can hide our motives from God. Now, let's talk about something else, though. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28, David's instructions to Solomon include this at the very end of verse 9. Like I said, verse 9 here covers a whole lot of interesting things, but here he sums it up, and he says to Solomon, if you seek Him, He will be found by you. But if you forsake Him, He will cast you off forever. That sounds like a promise, doesn't it? If you seek Him, He'll be found by you. Oh wait, is that one of those quid pro quo things that we've been hearing about on the news? If you do this, you get this? Well, it is. God works that way. He gives us these promises with conditions attached. If we seek Him, that's what Solomon was told, if you seek God with the right mind, He will be found by you. You'll be successful. God will make it such that you can find Him. Just turn ahead a little bit to 2 Chronicles chapter 15. And just a short verse here, but this is when King Azariah was being instructed by God. Verse 15, chapter 15, verse 1, the Spirit of God came upon Azariah, the son of Oded, and he went out to meet Asa. Asa was the king, Azariah's prophet, and said to him, Hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will forsake you. So this was a message echoed to the kings all along through 1st and 2nd Kings, and then all kings of Judah that read about the Chronicles. If you seek him, he'll be found by you. But, let's see if I can get that to come up. The reason is God is actively seeking those who are looking for him. I think that's kind of an interesting concept. It's like me out there with my metal detector looking for artifacts, I'm trying to find them, kind of like, seeking the Lord. But those artifacts are not going to be giving me signals. I have to get right on top of one, and it has to bounce something back off of that metal detector. With God, it's kind of like the things I'm seeking with that metal detector are looking for me too. And they're giving me information to help me find them. Well, that's interesting. It's a concept that we're not real familiar with, but God does it. 2 Chronicles chapter 16, turn over a page. This is during the time of King Asa again. And along about verse 9, Asa is told this by Hanani, a prophet, a seer that came to him when he was about to go to battle. And he says, For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. In this you have done foolishly. Therefore from now on you shall have wars. But look at that early part there. The Lord goes to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong. He's seeking those with a loyal heart to serve him. God has his radar out. And if we're the ones who are saying, I'm loyal, I'm willing, I'm seeking God, that's going to interact. God will make that possible for us. And so we are able to fulfill or gain something from that promise that he gives. The key is to seek him with all your heart. Prophet Jeremiah, I think over in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 13 or so, as Jeremiah is prophesying to the people of Judah, telling them about what's going to happen after 70 years of Babylonian captivity, and they're going to return. God tells them this, about verse 10 or so, For thus says the Lord, after 70 years are completed at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you, and cause you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and go and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. There's some consolation there. Those people of Judah were about to be captives for 70 long years in Babylon, and God's telling them, if you seek me the right way, I'll be looking for you. I'll keep the light on for you, so to speak. God will be ready for you to come and seek him out. Matthew chapter 7, same idea. Verses 7 and 8 there. Get back to that. Where Jesus says, Ask and it shall be given to you. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened unto you. For everyone who asks receives. And he who seeks finds. And to him who knocks it will be opened. But realize that part of what Jesus is telling us there is that faith is necessary for that to happen. We have to believe that God will hear us and that he's listening, and if we're his children, he will hear us. So, what's the question here? Are we making a diligent effort, us, to find God, to learn and do his will? Are we transmitting our signal so that God will pick it up and return us that promise that he says we'll have? Another promise too, though, is kind of a negative one. God says, if you forsake me, you'll be cast off forever. Prophet Isaiah echoes that to the people of Israel. He says, if you turn away from God, if you forsake him, then he will cast you off forever. it won't be just a minor blip. It'll be a permanent departure. God will take you and cast you off, just as He promised to do to Israel back in 1 Kings chapter 9. Again, turn back again to the Old Testament, 1 Kings chapter 9, and this is again the record from the Kings about Solomon. And let's look at verse 6, 7, 8 in chapter 9. And I will get back over to that here. This is the Lord appearing to Solomon as he is about to be put in place as king. And he says, verse 6, "But if you or your sons at all turn from following me and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them. And this house which I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all people. And as for this house which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss and say, Why has the Lord done this to the land and to his house? Then they will answer, Because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have embraced other gods and worshipped them and served them, and therefore the Lord has brought all this calamity on them." I mean, it is quite clear how God feels about this. There is this promise of destruction if we turn away from Him, given first to the Israelites and the people of Judah, but now it's even coming up in the New Testament. We turn to John chapter 15. Jesus there tells His disciples kind of the same thing. He says, "I'm the vine and you are the branches. You're to remain abiding in me." But notice how He puts it. There's a promise attached here as well. Chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, Jesus says, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, He prunes, that it may bear more fruit." But look at verse 6. "If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned." So, the destruction He spoke of concerning Israel and Judah is still present with God. That is what the end result is if we turn away from Him and don't bear fruit as His disciples. So how sad and terrible is it to go through life and death without God at our side? When we think about the terrible nature of that, it should make us even more willing to open up our mind to what God says. And starting from as early as we can, to train our mind to be what God wants to see. There's so much involved today in training children to behave a certain way, to do a certain thing. I'm afraid we're missing out on the most important part. You know, we're addressing the wheels and the brakes when we should be talking about the engine and the computer and the guy behind the wheel. We need to be talking about what drives people to do things. Are our children learning, do this, don't do that? Or are they learning, open up your mind and see what God says and do what that is? And then all the other things will fall into place. It's kind of a tricky thing. I know as a parent, I probably missed the boat many times on that particular idea, but I see better now after looking at this what it really means. Well, as we've done, there's still much more we could learn from the Chronicles. We didn't get time to go through many of the kings and their events and what happened to them, but we'll save that for a later time. For this afternoon, what we'd really like to do is end with the thought that we get such good information here that God expects us to make use of it. I mean, it's nice to learn about the kings and all of the things going on with them, but really, like we read earlier, our mind is supposed to put into practice the things that we learn. And we would hope that tonight, this afternoon, will be the time when you and I will do that. We learn what God expects of us, like Solomon did. Now, we didn't get to read about it, but you know the eventual end of Solomon. He lost the kingdom. He departed from God. He went away from God's way. And sadly, when his son Rehoboam took over, that caused a great rift and the kingdom was divided, and from there on it was just nothing but trouble. So, what are we thinking ourselves? Do we want to wait until trouble comes, until that God brings about that great destruction, he says. Or maybe it would be better to, early on, recognize who God is, what he expects of us, how we find out about it, and then how do we motivate ourselves to do it. Part of that is in this song we're about to sing. It's a grand theme of the Bible, that God is able. Whatever our need, if we're seeking him with the right heart, he will deliver, and that's what we're going to sing about. We hope that you'll think on these things.